starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nelson Phillips. I'll introduce myself in a minute, but let me start by explaining a little bit about what the podcast webinar is about, and make sure that everyone's on board with what we're going to talk about. The topic for today's webinar is leadership and what's happening to leadership and how leaders need to be developed given the digital transformation that's happening. So my interest is really around leadership development, and specifically how we develop leaders for the industries and firms that are going through these processes of digital transformation. I think that's a really pressing question for many companies, small, medium, and large, and that's what I'd like to talk about a bit today. I'm going to talk for 25-30 minutes, go through some points that I think are important, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. When we get to that point, I'll remind you there's a questions tab where you can type your questions. You can type your questions anytime. If one comes to you and you would like to type it, I'll have a look at them at the end and go through and try to answer them as best I can. Or you can wait till the end and type your questions live, whichever you like. But we'll get to that in 20-25 minutes or so. So thank you again for joining. So at Imperial College, we have an executive education activity, a bunch of different programs. One of the programs that we do is one that deals with the themes we're going to talk about today. We have both open and custom programs, and one of the open programs which I run is about leadership in a world that is characterized by technology, particularly digital technology. So the themes and things that I'm going to talk about are really core to that program, and I'll talk a little bit about that again at the end. All right. Okay. Very good. Okay, sorry if you couldn't see my screen. Starting with me, just to give you a bit of an introduction. So as I said, my name is Nelson Phillips. I'm a professor at the business school at Imperial College. I'm strategy innovation. What I do kind of cuts across innovation, strategy, and leadership. I put this little picture on the bottom right, and if you were all here in the room, I would do a little poll about who recognizes what that is down on the right, and I would also ask if you ever had one, which would give me an indication of the level of geekiness in the room. So this, of course, is a slide rule, and I'm a person who used to have one. I don't have one anymore. I do have a colleague here at Imperial who has a collection of slide rules, but they're not around very much. But if you had one, and if you recognize one, then you're kind of part of the group that I identify with. You're a geek. And I started out life as a computer engineer, ended up coming into business and getting interested in starting a business, and then getting interested in studying business, and ended up studying innovation, technology, and then got really interested in this question of digital transformation, which is what I'm spending a lot of time on now. And specifically this question we're going to talk about, which is, what does digital transformation mean for leaders? Because we're getting a better and better idea about what's happening, how digital transformation occurs, but now we're also beginning to understand a bit more about what this means. What are the new challenges for leaders that have occurred around this process? Now, what's interesting to me is none of the old challenges have gone away. So leaders still have all the same challenges they used to have around managing people, motivating people, around developing strategy, all the kind of stuff that they used to have to do. But now there's another layer of complexity to leadership positions in organizations around the huge challenges of effectively integrating digital technologies into organizations, using them in an effective way, and dealing with the fallout of those things. So that's what I want to talk about. So not just so much how digital technology leads to new products and services, but how it really drives change in organizations and demands different kinds of leaders. That's what I'd like to spend a few minutes with you on this afternoon. Okay, so where should we start? Well, leadership and digital transformation. Best thing we can do is start talking a little bit about what I mean when I say that, because I think it's a word we sort of, or it's a phrase, digital transformation, that we use a lot. that you hear around. But it's useful just to step back and think, what do we actually mean? What's digital transformation? What's the difference between simply adopting a piece of technology and a transformation? Why is this word used, or these two words used? And I think thinking back to the last time we had this level of a transformation helps to understand this one. So the first picture on my slide on the left, of course, is a form of transportation that was around for several hundred years. That was pretty well understood, pretty basic. And there was a fundamental transformation. Again, it wasn't in that case a digital transformation. It was another kind of transformation. It was an industrial transformation that happened between that horse and carriage and that Model T. So Henry Ford's Model T, that car with its internal combustion engine, in many ways shares a lot of characteristics of the horse and wagon, horse and buggy. But it's not just the car that was different. It was the fact that the car was made on an assembly line by large organizations that were bureaucracies, and it transformed life by changing the way people could move around. Everything from the invention of the vacation, the 9-to-5 workday, Henry Ford's decision to lower the cost, lower the cost of the cars and raise the salary so that they could be widely available. That made cars suddenly something everyone could have. Transformed society. If you can't overstate the difference that between 1865 and 1930 in terms of just the tremendous shift in Western societies caused by this whole bundle of technology. So it's not just the car. It's the car, of course, that's important. But it's also the assembly line, as I said, the bureaucracy, and all this sort of infrastructure and work patterns and everything that were all shaped by a set of technological inventions. Now, if we move to the next one, we have something else that looks kind of like a car. It's a Tesla, of course. Now, what's interesting about that, of course, is that, again, there's a shift in the powertrain. We're going from internal combustion to electric, but the shift is much bigger. The shift isn't just about a battery and an electric engine. In fact, at the time of the Model T, there was one of the options that many cars were using was electric. There were electric cars, at the very beginning of the car industry. It didn't become the dominant design then, but it was used. That clearly wasn't that wasn't a transformation to use that different technology. So it was a transformation now. Well, it's that these cars are digitally enabled. They can drive themselves. They can park themselves. In fact, I have a friend who has a Tesla, and he gets very excited when the Tesla updates its own operating system. So suddenly they'll come out in the morning. It will have updated its software, and it'll suddenly have new features. The GPS will work differently. It'll ask him to reconfigure things because it can do something new. And this car actually is much more than just the physical car. Just like the Model T was much more than the Model T. It was about a whole infrastructure. This again is the same, and in the level of kind of change that is embedded in this car is huge. Right? The electric part is important, but even more important is the technology part and what the embedding of digital technology into a car and really enabling a car to be something fundamentally different. And the whole world around it is what's causing the challenge for organizations, and then the challenge for leaders that I think is so important, so interesting, that I want to talk about with you today. So what kinds of things am I talking about? Well, all the stuff we've been reading about, okay? Big data, AI, blockchain, and robotics, I think, are the four most critical ones. So the first thing all leaders need to have an idea what these are. You need to have an idea. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to be able to come up with new products and services based on those. You have people in your company probably who are responsible for that, or fintech companies that will do that. But you do need to have enough understanding to realize how these are going to impact work and how your actual organization functions and how it's shaping the products and services that your company offers to the world and the customer experience that your customers or clients are experiencing. Leaders need to understand that. One of the things I find, first of all, is that there's a lot of leaders in organizations, very high up in organizations, who don't really understand the basics of these technologies and who are not very comfortable admitting that. And what we have is a lot of people in organizations faking an understanding of what these things are, or overstating their competence because of a lot of uncomfortable feelings around not knowing. They're used to being people who knew, and now they're not. And so the first thing we have is just a necessity to educate people, and not just educate them on the technology, a bit of that, but to educate them on why the technology is going to change work and their organization so much, right? What's going to happen in terms of business models, what's going to happen in terms of how we organize, and how do we shape and reshape jobs? Because we know that these technologies are going to mean a lot of jobs disappear, but they're also going to mean that a lot of jobs change fundamentally. And that's actually gives organizations a chance to rethink the way they work, which is really exciting, but you can only do that if you really understand how these technologies are going to impact the core processes in your organization. So this is a really important part of being an effective digital leader. There's some other ones, but I think these four, which I refer to as the horsemen of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. That's why I have that picture on the bottom. Not that they're actually that bad, but people seem to talk about them as if they're going to destroy the world. They're not going to destroy the world. They're going to create a lot of opportunity if people are prepared to seize it. There's some other things which are interesting, and depending on your company, these may or may not be may be important, but they're ones that they're certainly part of the digital sort of transformation of society. Everything from the sharing economy, Internet of Things, drones. For different companies in different industries, these may be really, really, really fundamentally transformative. So it may be necessary for the leadership in organizations to be very have at least the basic, clear understanding of what these things are, how they work, and what goes on. So the first big part for leaders in your organization is to understand what is digital transformation, what are the digital technologies that are important, and what are the effects that they're having. So that's thing one. We need to basically school people in these basic technologies, how they work, what they do, and have them get a structured way for organizations to think through not the impact on their products and services, but the impact on the way they work in the organizations. I think that's the next big step in this digital transformation process. Get leaders up to speed. But it's not just about the changes to organizations; it's also changes to people. And I think that I really like this picture of a sign. In case of fire, please leave the building before posting it on social media. There's a change in people because of their kind of encounter with digital technologies, actually transforming how people think, how they work, but also how they live their lives. And this has a huge impact in terms of how we need to motivate and manage people in organizations. And we really need to think through what this means and how it's working, right? So I have some examples. We have, of course, Facebook in the middle, Mr. Zuckerberg, and the impact that Facebook has had on how we interact with other people, how we communicate. Although Facebook is having its own struggles at the moment, it still has had a huge impact on a whole generation of people who've grown up with Facebook as a way to organize their friendship network. Apps on phone, all the really interesting, complicated apps varied forms of apps that exist, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of different apps that provide people with brand new ways and interesting ways to do stuff. One of which is on the left, which is of course Tinder, which has changed the online dating, has changed the way we meet. More than 50% of people now meet their future partner online. So this is now the norm, not the exception, but the norm. This changes people. This changes society, and this changes the way people communicate, the way people engage with one another, the way they want to work, the way they want to be treated in organizations, and what their expectations are for how things are going to function. So this is part of digital transformation. It transforms industries, organizations, and people. So I think the three challenges I want to talk quickly about are one that if you're going to be a leader, you need to understand what's happening with this whole transformation. I already talked about that, but you need to understand a little bit about what disruption is and why that's so important, because I think we're at the only very beginning of the process of disruption that's happening in industry after industry after industry, as fundamental business models are challenged by digital alternatives. There's some stuff going on around people, as I said. I'll talk about that just briefly in terms of a way to think about that is about the diversity between in organizations is increasing as the number of generations in organizations is increasing, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And then we need to create organizations. So as leaders, we need to be able to create organizations that are able to be customer-centric, risk-taking, and where experimentation is the norm. And I'll talk quickly about each of those. So starting with disruption, I think I like to sort of start and when I'm having these conversations with groups of leaders, is just to ask people what do they think disruption is, and disruption isn't change. Right? Disruption isn't change. Disruption is simply when there's a technology, a digital disruption happens when a digital technology creates a new business model, creates a new way of doing business that is value destroying for existing companies. So the way we used to do business, we can no longer do business. Lots of digital innovation, technological innovation, is value enhancing. Existing incumbents can use it to enhance their current business model. A disruptive innovation is one where that innovation allows a new form of business model to be developed that is value destroying for existing companies. The way we did things, we can no longer do them anymore. So Kodak, chemical-based imaging, disrupted by digital imaging, which was completely value destroying. The way they did things no longer had any value. Their core competencies and knowledge never had any, completely lost value. There was no way to leverage this existing set of core competencies that were really, really valuable before the disruptive innovation appeared. And lots of companies have their industries radically changed, but don't have their core sort of capabilities and resources made valueless or eroded in value. The new technology actually supports it. So you really have to understand, is this about digital technology giving us a way to enhance our business models? Yes, we have to change, and we have to change dramatically, but we are going to survive, or is this disruption where we could die? This is a really important part. So I think leaders, all leaders in organizations, all people who are involved in strategy and strategy implementation really need to understand this. They need to understand what disruption is, how it works, and this is an important part of developing leaders, no matter where they work in the organization. They need to understand, because this is just part of what's happening in every industry, and which is a real challenge for all industries and all leaders. And questions like, how does it happen? How do you fight back? Those are the core issues that need to be discussed in managers, just like they need to understand the technologies, they need to understand these questions about disruption. Generational change, I mentioned that above. I think the idea that generations occur is pretty much everyone accepts that. It's not about a certain number of years. It's that people who are in a particular generation share a set of experiences. So people who were teenagers and young in their 20s during the 1960s had a particular experience, especially in the U.S. with peace sort of movement and a whole bunch of things that happened. That was the baby boomers. They were a particular cohort. They experienced that. What we've had for the last while is a new generation, a generation that's grown up, that has had a fundamentally different experience, because from the time they were little, they were involved in digital technology. Their lives were always characterized by digital technology. These are people for whom the idea of being lost doesn't have any real meaning, because how can you be lost if you have Google Maps? Well, how is it? Why do we even have the word? It's impossible. How do you get lost? Is your battery dead? Right? People who for whom dating is online dating. People for whom Google has always been there. Right? So those people are what I think can be very usefully referred to as digital natives, and I think that's the biggest split we've seen for a long time, is between people who were born before these technologies and encountered them as adults, or people who were born into these technologies. And the term which people use a lot is digital natives versus digital immigrants. And I think that's a really good way to frame it, because it is like for people who were born before 1980, who were kind of came into it, they encountered this when their brains were already developed, they already had their patterns of communication and stuff in place. And this is a new world that they're entering. It isn't the world they're from. They're immigrants. Digital natives, they're born into this world. They live in this world without an accent. They speak digital without an accent. And there's a little cartoon here. Hi, sweetie, how was school today? Dad says, you can read it about it in my blog. Right? The dad just wants to have a chat, because that's the way he's used to communicating. The daughter, well, I put it in my blog. Didn't you see it? Why do we have to talk about this? Right? It's a completely different way of communicating and interacting. And that has a huge impact in organizations. Some interesting statistics that I use that I think are helpful in showing how different the generations are. Right? I mean, the older you are, the more chance you don't have your phone in the room, or certainly not in bed with you. Right? My mother, she only turns her phone on when she wants to make a call. right? Now the mat's off. You can't phone her on her mobile. She doesn't think about it that way. It's for her to use to make calls. Whereas you have millennials, 83% of them have their cell phone on in bed with them when they're asleep, because they're so connected to their phones, right? So and you can see the percentages there. So this means it's a really different way of communicating, a really different way of interacting that has huge importance for organizations. Lots of other stuff in terms of style and stuff. Some of them are just interesting. I always like the tattoo one. It's one of my favorite millennial tattoos. Think differently by putting a corporate logo on your arm. If you're from an earlier generation, that seems like a very odd thing to do. But you can see lots of tattoos. Tattoos are very highly associated with millennials, and 15% of millennials, so people born after 2000, report having 5 or more tattoos. So what does this mean? Well, this makes really interesting challenges at work, because you end up with 3 and increasingly 4 different generations all at work at the same time. So this requires real skill and understanding to create HR systems, ways of communicating, change programs that bring together and appeal to all these different generational styles. How do you do that? We had enough trouble when the baby boomers were in charge and Generation X entered the workforce. Now we're in a case where we have 2, and because people are retiring later and later, or even returnees, people go off to retire and then come back to work. So what you have is this increasing variety of people in organizations, major challenge for leaders. It's also very important that these leaders understand the importance of some particular characteristics of successful organizations in digital environments, in digitally enabled environments, and high technology digitally enabled environments. First one is that we need to make sure that people are able to take risk, right? We need to differentiate between good failure and bad failure, right? And between good success and bad success. What does that mean? Well, a good failure is a failure where we learn. We ran an experiment. We did something. We tried. We did our best. We put everything in place, and we set it up so we would learn as much as we could. Right? We learn and we understand why we failed. We've learned from it. That's a good failure. If we just made a mistake, that's a bad failure. Good success. We did everything right. We did it, and we can do it again because we understand what we did and we gathered information. Bad success. We succeeded, but we have no idea why. It was a fluke. Can't do it again. So we want to reward good failure and good success, and not reward bad failure and not bad. So we don't just say, oh, it's okay to fail. It's not okay to fail. It's okay to fail well. Right? That's very important, right? You need to give people the space to take some risk if you're going to see the level of innovation that's required in modern companies. That gets me to the next one. You need to teach people how to run good experiments, right? And you can do experiments in any area. These are some companies that I talk about when I teach these topics: Booking.com, Gray's, and the UK government. Completely different, but they all found it really useful to run experiments. So what you want to do is run experiments where they're cheap, they happen quickly, and if you're going to fail, you fail fast. If you're going to succeed, you succeed fast, so you can build on and move ahead. Each experiment needs to be about one question, right? So you need to have a question. What's our question? What are we going to do? So here's our question. We think the world works like this. How do we run an experiment to test that, right? So Department of Business, right, use rapid trials with their emails. So they tried different things really quickly, changes in language to see the response. They didn't do a big study to try to find out. They didn't try to determine up front. They just said, let's try this, let's try that. And let's make sure we set up a system where we learn from each test, where we get as much information as we can. Very simple way to take an experimental culture, to the experimental view, instead of the traditional, let's find out all the information we can beforehand and make sure we don't mess it up. And this is also, we're in a world where everyone expects to be treated by every company as well as they're treated by their favorite app, right? So, things should be cheap and they should work really well and they should always work, right? And we should be treated, everyone wants to be treated by every company as if that company was Apple, or whatever company the customers likes to really use as their best experience of customer service. So this expectation of how good customer service should be keeps going up because companies are getting better, and everyone, even inside of companies, you can be talking. Your customer doesn't have to be external. Your customer can also be an internal customer. that's fine. They still have the same expectations. It could be business to business. They still expect the same level of customer service. And I can't even tell you how many times I've heard now, why isn't there an app for that? Right? You know, someone wants to find something in a grocery store. Why am I asking someone in the grocery store, why don't I have an app on my phone where I can say I'm a Waitrose app that tells me where's the cornflakes? And the app tells me where it is on what shelf. Like, why isn't there an app? And for Waitrose, that's a challenge. They need to develop this because other instances, there is an app. So there's just an increasing demand for higher levels of interaction, support, and simplicity. And understanding your customer, client, internal customer, business-to-business customer requires everyone to understand what this means and get it right. So this is another part of generating or developing a culture that really supports digital transformation. So coming to the end of the topics I want to talk about, I mean, I think what I've hopefully given you a taster of what are the sorts of things we need to add on to traditional leadership to become really successful leaders in the context of digital transformation, which is about understanding what's going on in the environment in terms of disruption and what these new technologies are, understanding how that affects organizations in terms of people, people being different, work looking different, work being enabled in different ways, and then for leaders themselves, what do they need to know? What new skills do they need? What are they going to have to be able to do to deal with organizations as they go through this process of transformation, not just in products and services, but also in terms of the way the organization works inside. So this is really the kind of stuff that I'm thinking a lot about. It's also the kind of stuff, if you're interested and want to go deeper, we have a course that takes all these kind of themes and goes much deeper into them. And there's one coming up in May and June. If you're interested, you can have a look at the website. It's 6 days where we look at traditional leadership development, but add on top of that these kind of themes about technology, disruption, and managing generational change and all these kind of questions. So thank you for spending some time with me. If you have any questions, that'd be great. You just type them in. If you click on the questions thing, I'll just do that. We can see. I can see whatever questions you have. So, I think I can. Yeah. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask away. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay. So first question. Okay, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure. Clicked on the 1-1. Oh, good. Okay, Michelle, I'm very pleased that you found that useful. If anyone has any particular questions about any of these aspects or about anything really to do with digital transformation, this kind of these business questions, very happy to answer. We're actually in we're in the middle of one of these programs right now, and it's very interesting seeing the different attendees and what their kind of concerns and interests are. We're able to add and develop more the content. We have a lot of interest in these questions around culture and how technology is impacting and requires different kinds of cultures. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Khaled. That's great. I'm really happy. What are the key skills? I mean, there's a set of skills. Thank you for that question. There's a set of skills that are really around managing culture. So there's a bunch of some knowledge around how technology works, how digital technology is impacting organizations, what opportunities that means. There's a bunch of stuff about disruption. The skills are around how to both bring in and manage change and how to manage culture to produce the kind of culture that can absorb and leverage these new technologies. So I think there's a set of skills which extend the same kind of the same things you used to do, but do them in a different way. Also, the generational stuff means you need to learn kind of some new skills about how to communicate with people who are diverse in a different way than you're used to. It's about generational diversity instead of about ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, linguistic diversity. Now we have this increasing digital diversity. So how do we communicate with these people? What does it mean to communicate across if you have to communicate up generations and down at the same time? That's a challenge, right? Okay, great. A couple other questions here. Disruptive business. So I think that there's two parts to being a disruptive business. One is that if you mean if you're going to be a company that's going to create a disruption, you need to be very different than the companies that you're disrupting. If you look at it in terms of your culture, because of your culture, in terms of your structure, in terms of your core resources and capabilities. Why? Because your business model is different. The whole point of being a disruptor is that you're coming in with a different business model. So when you look at when this is, when there's real disruption, you see companies coming in. And this is also the reason why incumbents often struggle to match disruptors, because they have a particular way they're organized, a particular way they're structured, a particular culture. And when the disruptor comes in, they not only have to try to match their business model, but their whole organization is structured the wrong way. They have the wrong culture, and it's very difficult. And this is why you see lots of cases, a majority of cases, incumbents, if there's truly fundamental disruption, the majority of incumbents don't survive that, right? So if you look at mobile phones, the smartphone, none of the mobile phone companies that existed before made the transition, right? So Ericsson, Nokia, Sony, they're all gone. Motorola, BlackBerry, they're all gone. When they went to, none of them were able to make a smartphone. Why? Not because they're not smart, but because they had the wrong organizations, the wrong cultures, and all that kind of stuff. So great question. Okay, Sam. Mobile apps. Okay, very good. Oh yeah. I think mobile apps is one of the best tools for bridging the generational gap. Especially, I think that's one of the reasons for the success of things like Slack is that they can actually, if you train older generation people to use it and explain to why they need to use it and get them on, they're actually quite excited about it, and it matches the communication style and motivational kind of patterns of younger people. So I think apps and new communication technologies really do help. Part of it's just a communication thing, getting people to understand there's different people with different styles, and we have to all kind of make an effort to come up with ways that work for everyone. And that's going to mean everyone's going to have to compromise a little. But apps are really good, and I think there's more and more apps available, which just make things easier, but also actually really help in terms of bridging the gap. So that's a good point, Sam. I think in terms of leadership and management, some of it's just thinking through how can we use new technologies in a way that helps us to overcome different styles of working, and it actually maybe motivates everyone. I think that's actually possible to do. This one? Okay, what else we have here? Oh, you guys are great. Can an existing business become a disruptor? Thank you, Paulie. Yes, it can. It certainly is the case that what you see quite often is that innovative companies, that even if they're existing large businesses, go into other industries and disrupt. It's often hard to self-disrupt. That's quite difficult, but because you are deeply into a particular way of thinking, its particular business model. But if you think about Apple, and just use a very common example, if you think about Apple entry into the mobile phone market, that was a big existing company. They completely disrupted mobile phones, right? So in fact, what you see this is that's quite a common occurrence if there's a lot of capital and a lot of complementary resources needed to support a disruptive innovation. It'll often be a big incumbent, but from another industry that comes in and supports it, because no small firm can do this. No small firm has the resources and capabilities. So what you see in these cases where you need a lot of resources and a lot of specialized resources, the incumbents can't quite get there. You have someone come in from outside and actually thrive in a new industry. It's very interesting. And we talk a lot about that on the course, and we talk a lot about that in general when we think about strategy and how industries work. It's really good to understand that. Patient-centered care. Okay, that's quite a digital. I mean, I think Omar is asking about patient-centered care, which I have to say I'm not an expert in. It seems to me that whenever you're trying to create any kind of customer, user, client-centered anything, any sort of digital communication technologies are hugely helpful, because that's a way to drive customer centricity, to make everyone more focused on what that person needs and wants, because they can communicate it better because they have access to digital channels, and data can be collected. Lots of data can be collected that isn't entered by the actual patient or by the client or customer, but is gathered in other ways that helps the company or the team or the whatever it is to deliver really good service that's focused on that particular person or organization's needs. So I think that's a really good avenue, Omar, to follow, is to think about how having more digitally intelligent leaders in your organization could let them be more effective at developing really client-centered, in this case, patient-centered care, in this case. So the thing about communication, Doris is asking what kind of communication skills. It's a couple of things. One is style of communication. The other is media. So if you're communicating with older generation, there's lots of individual differences. So it's also very useful to make sure, if you're communicating just with one person, ask them. But in general, if you're communicating with more senior people who are a bit older, people who are from the baby boomers above, they quite like face-to-face meetings, or they like the telephone. If you're communicating with people who are younger generations, who are millennials or Generation Y, then they're much more into digital communications. They like the immediacy of some sort of messaging app, which could be a corporate messaging app, but they want to be able to type messages to each other but get real-time replies. That's their style of communication. They often don't like talking on the phone. If you look in the UK right now, about 40% of the mobile phones in the UK are never spoken on, right? Because they're owned by teenagers who text or Snapchat or Instagram, right? They're not big talkers on the phone. So if you're a parent and you have a 14-year-old son or daughter and you want to torture them, just keep phoning them, right? Then every time you phone, they're somewhere in a room with their friends going, "Oh, it's my mom," right? Why? Because they don't want to talk on the phone. It's not they don't like you. Why can't you learn to text like everyone else's mom, right? So it's really about thinking. Is there? And so if you're communicating with the whole group, then you think, well, how do I communicate with this group based on the kind of communication patterns? And you can look this up on the web. There's lots of stuff on how different age groups like to be communicated with, and you can use that in an organizational setting. It's also useful just to have a conversation and to think, how can we communicate better with everyone and use multi-channel communication to make it more comfortable for everyone. Right? Okay, let's go down a little bit. Thank you for all these questions. This is really excellent, really interesting. I don't have all the answers, but certainly we can at least start a conversation. Do we need apps with big keys? Yeah, so Paulie, good question. There's certainly a group of people that think that's so and are producing apps and technology that are for older people. I think we're going to find that that like all markets, the older generations are segmented. There's some people in the old, my mom is 75, and it took her about 5 minutes to figure out Skype. Once someone told her it was free, it took her, she figured that out like that, right? And she doesn't have any problem with that. My dad, who's just a little bit older, he can't really get it to work. He can't figure out the idea. So we have to really think, for some older groups, we really do need to come up with technologies that are more accessible, that are simpler, that have features that make it accessible for them, like big keys, like less keys, or actually having a keyboard rather than having a smartphone if we're talking about phones. But lots of other technologies, there's different ways, and there's some really nice design methods for thinking through how you design things for people who are less able, either because they're older or they're disabled in some way. And those are really interesting areas where companies can can really both help people, and also they're great markets that in many ways are underserviced. And the older market, of course, is going to get much bigger. So there's going to be real opportunities there for people that get it right. Okay. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time. If you have one final question, that's fine. Otherwise, it's been really great talking to you. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to have an email chat with you about any of these topics, or try to give you point you in the direction of readings and things if there's a particular theme that interests you. And if you're interested in getting further into this stuff, please do consider coming on the course, because we'll cover a lot more detail and get into a lot of really interesting conversations with scientists and engineers about the technologies, with strategy specialists about what's happening with disruption, about innovation, and entrepreneurship specialists about what's going on with small firms versus big firms. So we have a lot of great conversations about these topics. So if you can join us, that would be fantastic. And otherwise, it's been really lovely talking to you.